I always say when it comes to political stripes, I don't give two hoots what color party you're coming from. There's one party, and that's the Canadian Party right now, making sure that we defend the hostile economic attacks from President Trump.
Ontario just signed the biggest trade deal in Canadian history, and America has no idea it happened. While Washington argues over tariffs and Ottawa drags its feet, Ontario went straight to Beijing, cutting a deal that bypasses federal control and rewrites Canada's economic future. No press conference, no debate, just a signature that shifts power, profit, and control, all without American approval. So why did Ontario go behind Ottawa's back? What does China get in return? And how will this ripple through your job, your cost of living, your future? Stick around, because this story exposes the biggest cover-up in Canadian politics. The constitutional loophole. Section 92 of the Constitution Act had always given provinces control over natural resources and local commerce. But no one had wielded it quite like this. Lawyer Sarah Chen had been studying the new Protect Ontario Through Free Trade Within Canada Act. What appeared to be an internal trade bill was actually something far more ambitious. It quietly enabled Ontario to build permanent structures for trade negotiations, without federal approval. While Ottawa debated treaties in Parliament, provinces could use their authority to strike practical deals on manufacturing standards, services, and resource policy. The legal path was already there. Ford had simply built a highway over it. Chen's analysis revealed something startling. Under international law, provinces could legally form trade partnerships in areas where they held jurisdiction. As long as they avoided customs or currency policy, they were free to negotiate. This interpretation had real teeth. Since 2017, 64% of federal exceptions under Canada's domestic trade deal had been removed. That created space for provinces to act. Ontario led the charge by eliminating all party-specific exceptions. Alberta and Manitoba followed, removing regulatory barriers one by one. Ford's legislation differed in one key way. It built institutional capacity, not one-off deals. Chen understood that this wasn't a technical loophole. It was a strategic tool, one that allowed provinces to trade with each other and potentially with the world. With legal backing secure, the question was no longer can they, but how far will they go? The Alliance Network. 6 provinces joined Ford's trade network. What started as collaboration quickly looked like rebellion. In Halifax, Premier Tim Houston prepared to finalize Nova Scotia's place in the alliance. Alberta, Manitoba, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick had already signed. Together with Ontario, these provinces represented over 60% of Canada's economy. Trade within Canada was worth $530 billion annually, almost 20% of the entire gross domestic product. This alliance was more than symbolic. It was functional, and it was growing. Danielle Smith of Alberta did not join out of loyalty to Ford, but because Ottawa's climate and energy policies were choking her province's economic future. The alliance offered something Ottawa could not: flexibility, speed, and focus on results. The network's strength was its diversity. Alberta brought energy. Ontario provided industry. The Maritimes offered shipping routes and European access. Each deal deepened the network's independence from federal interference. Supreme Court rulings confirmed it. Provinces had the authority to manage economic development and resources. Federal resistance was political, not legal. Even Manitoba, under Premier Wab Kinew's new Democratic leadership, joined, proving this was not just a conservative movement, but a national recalibration. Houston signed knowing this was bigger than regional cooperation. This was governance, without Ottawa. And across the Pacific, Beijing had already taken note. The federal fracture. The call from Ottawa came early. Jennifer Walsh, Ford's intergovernmental lead, listened as federal officials expressed concern about Ontario's growing trade autonomy. It was clear. Ford's success was making Ottawa look irrelevant. Prime Minister Mark Carney, a former banker, believed in central control, but Ford believed in immediate results. With Ontario's deficit reaching $14.6 billion and unemployment at 7.6%, Ford needed more than theory. He needed contracts now. Ottawa claimed provinces could not conduct foreign policy. Ford's legal team pointed to decades of precedent. In resource management and commerce, provinces were fully within their rights. The real tension was philosophical. Ottawa chased diplomatic coherence. The provinces chased economic survival. Federal policy toward China only deepened the gap. Ottawa's distancing strategy cost Ontario companies real business. Ford's voters cared about jobs, not political optics. As more provinces joined Ford's alliance and businesses thrived, it became harder to argue against the results. The interprovincial trade network worked. Federal policy did not. Walsh understood the stakes. This was not just about trade agreements. It was about who controlled the economic future of the country. And somewhere in Shanghai, a proposal was being finalized. It would soon challenge every federal assumption about Canadian unity. The economic magnet. The spreadsheet in Roberto Martinez's Mississauga office reflected more than quarterly figures. It captured the collapse of an era. His parts company, once thriving on contracts from Detroit, was facing crushing American tariffs. The unexpected email from Shanghai, offering direct orders, wasn't just tempting. It was his company's best chance at survival. China's economy was over 6 times the size of Canada's, and growing at 3 times the pace. Its demand for specialized manufacturing aligned perfectly with Ontario's strengths. While Washington played geopolitical games, Chinese firms were offering long-term contracts and better pricing than Detroit ever had. Lisa Chen, an analyst with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, had seen this trend accelerating. Her models suggested that Chinese demand could fill the vacuum left by fading U.S. deals. Chemicals, machinery, automotive components, even vegetable oil exports. We're seeing Chinese interest spike just as American access grew unstable. The numbers supported this shift. Ontario firms accounted for 40% of all Canadian companies operating in China. These weren't hypothetical futures. They were active relationships, now more vital than ever. Martinez reread the offer. It wasn't just profitable, it was predictable, scalable, and detached from political turbulence. For manufacturers across Ontario, the logic was unavoidable. Growth came from the East now. And the East was calling loudly. Look, we analyzed dozens of economic reports and trade data that took economists years to compile. You just got the bottom line in 5 minutes. Ontario could replace American markets with Chinese ones and come out ahead. Subscribe if you want more insights that cut through the noise. The supply chain salvation. David Park no longer optimized routes. He performed economic triage. At his logistics firm in Waterloo, American tariffs had flipped every assumption. Contracts that once stretched years were evaporating in weeks, while Chinese offers filled the gaps left behind. Plants in Kitchener once focused entirely on U.S. pork exports. Now they were diverting nearly $500 million toward Chinese buyers. Canola processors redirected close to $1 billion in meal exports to Shanghai. Where chaos had ruled, new order was taking shape. Chinese logistics firms were stepping in to make these transitions seamless. They weren't just customers, they were co-builders. Port improvements, warehouse expansions, and transport upgrades were now being offered by Chinese partners who wanted reliability in return. Sarah Kim, a consultant working alongside Park, saw the writing on the wall. Chinese buyers provided longer contracts, predictable pricing, and smoother coordination. American partners, once the gold standard, now came with risk, volatility, and political micromanagement. Chinese technology brought a further edge: automated inventory systems, AI-driven route optimization, and turnkey warehousing. These weren't stopgap fixes. They were infrastructure reinventions. Park watched as container after container bypassed American ports entirely, heading to Asia directly. The shift wasn't theoretical anymore. Chinese supply chains weren't just replacing US ones, they were outperforming them. And Park knew. This was just the beginning. A technology exchange. Lisa Wong stood in her Burlington factory, watching Chinese engineers inspect her electric vehicle battery systems. Technology that had failed to attract a single American investor. Now, Chinese firms were not only buying but proposing joint development. This was the new norm in Ontario's tech sector. Instead of restrictive intellectual property negotiations, Chinese partners offered mutual development and guaranteed market access. It wasn't about handing over secrets. It was about building something together. Dr. Michael Chen at the University of Waterloo had tracked the rise of these collaborations. Chinese investment in clean technology, energy storage, and even artificial intelligence was growing fast. The partnerships offered research funding, scale, and integration that North American partners simply no longer matched. Chinese firms weren't just buyers. They were collaborators, bringing not only market scale, but manufacturing know-how and rapid deployment capacity. Electric vehicles, solar components, wind turbines. Everything Ontario needed to scale was available through these partnerships. The education connection added depth. Chinese students brought knowledge, and Canadian institutions gained access to Chinese innovation networks. Annual educational services to China had reached nearly $2 billion. And much of that drove future technology collaborations. Wong reviewed her latest proposal from Shanghai. It offered what no North American deal had ever delivered: growth, security, and partnership. It was no longer about where the ideas started, it was about who helped them fly. The infrastructure invitation. Architectural blueprints covered Minister Caroline Williams' conference table. The Chinese proposals weren't just about new buildings. They were about remaking Ontario's global trade position. High-speed rail, expanded ports, upgraded airports. These weren't wish lists. They were shovel-ready offers from firms that had already transformed entire continents. The Hamilton Port project, for example, would quadruple capacity and enable direct trade routes to Asia, skipping US bottlenecks altogether. Williams studied the terms: fixed pricing, no debt burden, no need for federal approval. In an environment where American infrastructure projects stumbled through gridlock and cost overruns, Chinese firms delivered with precision and speed. The Belt and Road Initiative was evolving, and Ontario had a chance to become its first North American hub. That meant more than trade. It meant technology transfer, construction jobs, and regional revitalization across the north through rail and energy upgrades. Chinese airlines were also in talks to make Toronto their North American gateway, with new flight routes and millions of inbound visitors. That alone would create thousands of service sector jobs. The decision facing Williams was clear. Chinese infrastructure deals weren't just about roads and rails. They were about independence, economic, logistical, and political. And somewhere, quietly, Ontario was preparing to accept the invitation. The invisible chains. 3 generations of the Morrison family had built their lives around a single factory in Oshawa, shaping parts for vehicles bound for the American Midwest. James Morrison, now in his 60s, remembered walking through those plant gates with his grandfather, who had proudly explained how every paycheck depended on American buyers. For decades, that bond between Ontario and the United States seemed unshakable, until it started to quietly unravel. At the lunch table, James watched his son Michael scrolling through job postings on his phone, trying to find something more stable. rumors were flying about more American contract cancellations, and the factory floor felt more uncertain by the day. What was once an invisible bond with American prosperity was now a visible threat to their livelihood. The numbers painted a sobering picture. More than 75% of Ontario's exports still flowed south, connecting millions of workers to the whims of American political and corporate decisions. When an automaker in Michigan adjusted production, workers in Ontario felt the aftershocks immediately. What once created security now generated fragility. Dr. Sarah Thompson, an economic analyst, had been tracking this for over a year. Her data revealed interlocking dependency webs so intricate that disrupting one node could collapse entire regional economies. The automotive supply chain alone tied hundreds of thousands of Ontario jobs to corporate strategy shifts in the United States. The Morrison family wasn't an exception. They were a case study. Mortgage payments, pensions, school budgets, and municipal taxes all depended on contracts that could be revoked by political whim. Thompson's research concluded that the comfort created by deep integration had left Ontario without alternatives. Prosperity had become a trap. That trap was built not only on dependency, but on specialization that now had no exit route. The network effect. Inside a logistics center in Toronto, Amanda Park watched a screen full of glowing lines, each one a real-time trade connection. The North American supply web had taken decades to build, but she was watching it unravel in weeks. American tariffs had knocked out several major routes, and the ripple effects were immediate. One disrupted steel shipment in Ohio meant layoffs in Oshawa, factory shutdowns in Kitchener, and stalled freight contracts in Hamilton. Park specialized in tracking these connections. Her models showed that Ontario's integration with American logistics had become so dense that a failure in one state could bring down multiple Canadian sectors. And as these failures increased, Chinese logistics firms were stepping in, not tentatively, but with precision. Chinese companies had already begun establishing North American operations. They offered Pacific shipping routes that bypassed American ports entirely. They deployed software systems that integrated directly with Ontario suppliers, providing smoother inventory tracking and faster freight coordination. Park's team could see it happening live, trade flows diverting, new connections forming, and Chinese firms becoming the new hub nodes of a once American network. Dr. Kevin Liu, a network theorist Park often collaborated with, described this shift as mathematically inevitable. Once a network's dominant node faltered, the system naturally reorganized around a more stable alternative. Chinese logistics firms were ready. American partners were retreating. Park understood the stakes. This wasn't just optimization. It was the rewiring of Ontario's entire trade reality. And each broken link to the United States made China's positioning more central, more indispensable. This wasn't just about logistics anymore. It was about survival and replacement. The replacement calculation. In a quiet office outside Guelph, Dr. Patricia Williams adjusted a simulation model on her screen. Her latest analysis didn't just tweak old assumptions. It dismantled them. She had spent months asking a question few dared to raise. Could Ontario actually replace its reliance on the American market? Her conclusion was simple, backed by spreadsheets and sectoral data. Not only could it should. American markets were shrinking in value and growing in volatility. Chinese demand, by contrast, was expanding at a staggering pace. Agricultural exports like canola, seafood, and pork were seeing double-digit growth to Chinese buyers, many of whom offered long-term contracts and price premiums that American distributors no longer matched. Williams ran her models again, this time projecting what Ontario's manufacturing sector could look like with full Chinese integration. Within 5 years, she estimated that exports could grow by $12 billion annually if political and logistical barriers were removed. Renewable energy components, electric vehicle parts, industrial robotics, Chinese partners wanted all of it. Her research extended beyond trade. Chinese infrastructure investment in northern Ontario could unlock mining and forestry projects stalled by federal red tape. New energy corridors, new ports, and new digital infrastructure. All of it supported by investment partners looking to build, not block. American restrictions were creating space. Chinese planners were filling it. The numbers weren't political. They were mathematical. Ontario's future prosperity was now tied to growth curves that America no longer offered. Williams closed her laptop and glanced out the window. The pivot wasn't hypothetical anymore. The calculation had been made, and the next step would come with a signature. The alliance fracture. Margaret Richardson sat in her Ottawa office, the glow of the secure video call illuminating decades of work unraveling in real time. The American delegation had delivered an ultimatum with no ambiguity. Ontario's growing partnerships with China were no longer compatible with the continental defense and economic frameworks that had defined North America since the middle of the 20th century. Yet each new announcement from Queen's Park triggered a backlash. Defense contracts were canceled. Intelligence sharing channels narrowed. Aerospace projects tied to bilateral military agreements dissolved without discussion. What was once a carefully managed alliance had become a series of retaliatory gestures. For Richardson, who had spent more than 3 decades working inside this alliance, it was personal. She had negotiated trade dispute settlements, security protocols, and joint exercises. Now she was watching institutions built over generations collapse in a matter of months. The Americans had begun treating Canadian independence as a liability. Federal officials in Washington reinterpreted joint agreements to exclude any partner with Chinese links. Canadian firms that had once depended on secure contracts were quietly blacklisted. Even educational partnerships and cultural exchange programs were severed under suspicion. The fracture was not just economic or diplomatic, it was ideological. American policymakers viewed Canadian pragmatism as betrayal. Meanwhile, Canada found itself forced to choose between alliance loyalty and economic viability. It was no longer a quiet divergence. It was a full rupture, one with consequences extending far beyond Ontario. The domino strategy, Quebec. Premier François Legault had been watching closely. Ontario's success in building autonomous trade relationships with China had changed more than the economy. It had changed the game. In Montreal, Legault's team laid out their analysis. Chinese firms were showing strong interest in Quebec's aerospace capacity, its vast hydroelectric power, and its forestry sector. The figures were clear. Potential gains from Chinese trade exceeded anything currently guaranteed through federal channels or American partners. And this was not limited to Quebec. Alberta had begun exploring energy agreements. British Columbia was in talks on port expansions. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick had initiated offshore wind and lumber discussions. From Saskatchewan's potash to Manitoba's rail networks, provincial leaders were discovering new leverage. For Quebec, this was a long-awaited opening. Economic sovereignty without full political separation had always seemed unattainable. Now, through trade, it appeared achievable. Chinese partnerships respected Quebec's distinctiveness in language, law, and culture, and offered access to francophone markets across Europe and Africa that were inaccessible through American or federal mechanisms. The federal government could no longer suppress or stall these discussions. Its policies had failed to produce results. premiers were taking matters into their own hands. Legault understood the historical weight. Through economic autonomy, provinces were achieving what political negotiations had long denied. Ontario had simply gone first, and now others were following, fast. The global realignment. In her office at Beijing University, international relations scholar Dr. Helen Chang finished her latest memo to party leadership. The Ontario case was no longer a case study. It had become strategic doctrine. The principle was elegantly simple. Where national governments resisted Chinese engagement for ideological or strategic reasons, subnational actors often did not. Provinces, states, and cities had economic needs they could not meet through stagnant federal channels. Ontario had proven this decisively. Now German states, Australian territories, and even American cities were quietly exploring similar channels. Dr. Chang's data showed that Chinese firms had created dedicated engagement divisions for subnational diplomacy. They understood regional constitutions, local regulatory frameworks, and electoral cycles. In democratic nations, where voters prioritize jobs and infrastructure over geopolitics, this level of specificity proved decisive. Across Europe, regional governments were forming new economic ties. In the United States, Chinese firms were quietly investing in green energy zones, tech clusters, and transportation hubs. The old belief that national policy could fully control international economic relations was fading fast. The Ontario model was now the blueprint. Bypass the ideological gridlock of national governments. Build prosperity at the ground level. Use results to gain legitimacy. Then replicate. What had begun as a workaround was becoming a new way to win influence. Without conflict, the new reality. From the CN Tower's observation deck, Alexandra Chen watched the harbor below. Cargo ships moved slowly, but the shift they represented had happened quickly. Her generation had grown up amid a silent transformation. American dominance was no longer an assumption. The jobs, investments, and partnerships they were preparing for all pointed east. The new economy spoke Mandarin, paid in yuan, and demanded skills tailored to Pacific trade. Canadian universities had responded. Business programs required Mandarin fluency. Trade schools offered certifications in Asian supply chain management. High school students studied Chinese history alongside Confederation. This wasn't a loss of identity, it was an evolution. Chinese festivals became municipal events. Dumplings and dim sum became part of Canadian cuisine. There was no resistance because the transition felt organic. Families like hers had already lived the shift, one generation at a time. Alexandra's peers saw something older generations often missed. They were not choosing between East and West. They were choosing opportunity over ideology. They knew which economies were growing, which jobs were multiplying, and which nations were offering long-term partnerships based on results, not rhetoric. The center of gravity had shifted. The future didn't belong to those holding on to the past. It belonged to those who saw what was coming and adapted. The closing pivot. Across boardrooms and parliaments, classrooms and construction sites, a consensus was forming, quietly but firmly. The old North American order had been based on assumptions no longer supported by reality. That American markets would always absorb Canadian exports. That shared defense meant shared interest. That prosperity flowed from south to north. Ontario's pivot shattered those beliefs. Not with protest or confrontation, but with trade agreements, infrastructure projects, and realigned supply chains. What followed was not chaos, but opportunity. Other provinces joined. Cities adjusted. Industries restructured. Canada didn't fall apart. it rewrote the script. The question was never about loyalty, it was about survival. When the cost of dependence grew higher than the risk of independence, the direction became inevitable. As American influence waned, China offered not only alternatives, but partnership on terms shaped by local needs and local leaders. In Shanghai and Beijing, in Shenzhen, the Ontario experiment was studied, replicated, and expanded. In Washington, it was resisted, then feared, then finally understood too late. As one more cargo ship docked under the Toronto skyline, the answer was no longer in question. The world had shifted, quietly, decisively, irreversibly. So what happens next? Will other provinces follow Ontario's lead? Can America counter this economic shift? Is this the beginning of North America's realignment, or just a temporary disruption? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you think this means for your future. Thanks for watching.